To possess a true self, one must be capable of enduring the absolute freezing void of isolation. Modern psychology often frames loneliness as an affliction to be cured, but the classical view is much darker. The herd is a trap. In 1851, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer published Parega and Paraliponomena, providing a clinical diagnosis of the human condition that functions as a mechanic's manual for social friction. He observed that human beings are plagued by a profound internal emptiness. Driven by a psychological terror of this void, individuals are biologically compelled to seek out the warmth of human society to survive the cold. Look at this thermal model of the Porcupine's Dilemma. As nodes huddle to share heat, they puncture one another. Competing egos and repulsive qualities guarantee mutual laceration. The pain becomes intolerable. Bleeding from closeness, they are forced to disperse, driven back into freezing isolation. This creates an agonizing, perpetual oscillation. Human life becomes a mechanical bouncing between two unbearable extremes: the bitter freezing of solitude and the violent bleeding of society. The conclusion is merciless. Intimacy cannot cure loneliness. It is a paradox where the very act of seeking warmth guarantees injury. Society itself is an inherently flawed survival mechanism. This philosophy was forged in brutal reality. Arthur Schopenhauer was born into a wealthy patrician merchant family in Danzig, surrounded by the mechanical scale and relentless noise of international trade. It was a dense, cosmopolitan environment designed to manufacture compliance. By 1807, that environment shifted to Weimar. His mother, Johanna, operated an opulent, highly social intellectual salon that attracted the most prominent writers and politicians of the era. The psychological profiles of mother and son were incompatible. Johanna was a vivacious extrovert who thrived on the validation of the herd. Arthur possessed a moody, depressive, and ruthlessly combative intellect that despised superficial chatter. The conflict resulted in a permanent severance. In a defining letter, Johanna diagnosed her son's uncompromising nature, writing, "You are unbearable and burdensome and very hard to live with." She could not tolerate an ego that refused to bend to the rules of polite company. When the biological imperative of family violently rejects an intellect that refuses to accommodate its surroundings, the polite society of strangers offers no sanctuary. To enter polite society, one must submit to its strict primary condition, mutual accommodation. The individual is required to suppress their true nature, sand down their edges, and feign interest to avoid offending the mediocre majority. Society operates on an assumption of equal rights, which falsely translates into a demand for equal intellect. In this environment, a genius is treated as a contraband item. Their mere existence is offensive because it exposes the dullness of everyone else in the room. To mask this dullness, the herd relies on cheap coping mechanisms. Schopenhauer identified national pride as the most pathetic tool, a collective vanity utilized strictly by those who lack individual qualities to revere. The formula is an inverse correlation. A rich internal intellectual life requires nearly zero external validation. A hollow mind requires constant external noise to drown out its own emptiness. Polite society functions as a marketplace of compromises, a system specifically engineered to strip the intellect of its autonomy in exchange for the comfort of the group. There is a cure to the Porcupine's Dilemma, but it requires enduring the cold. One must deliberately construct their own internal warmth through extreme, structured solitude. Schopenhauer applied this cure geographically. For his final 27 years, he retreated to an apartment along the River Main in Frankfurt, observing the dense architecture of human life from a strict, calculated distance. He engineered a monastic routine to eliminate societal friction. Every day began with a freezing cold bath at 7 in the morning, followed by rigid hours of reading, study, and a single cup of black coffee. He was famously sensitive to the auditory assault of the masses, viewing unnecessary noise as an insult to thought. He countered the chaotic sounds of the city with the precision of his own solitary daily flute practice. His only tolerated companions were a succession of pet poodles, the most famous named Atma. For Schopenhauer, animals expressed the pure, uncorrupted will. They interacted without the masks, deceits, and lies required by human society. Schopenhauer's final decades represent the successful, calculated implementation of an impenetrable psychological fortress against the noise of mediocrity. Structured solitude is the ultimate defense mechanism. By willingly accepting the cold, the superior intellect starves the herd of its power to inflict pain. The dilemma forces a choice between bleeding with the masses or freezing alone. Once you have walked away from the warmth of the herd, how do you construct the unshakable social skin to survive the freeze? Picture a 19th century ballroom. The elaborate curtsies, the precise distance between partners, the rigid choreographed smiles. These rules exist for a very specific, defensive reason. Think of a group of porcupines trapped outside on a freezing winter night. To survive the cold, they huddle together for warmth. But the closer they get, the more they stab each other with their sharp quills. They scatter to stop the pain, only to freeze again, forcing them back together in an endless cycle. After enough cycles of freezing and bleeding, they finally negotiate a middle ground, a specific distance where they share just enough heat to survive without drawing blood. In human society, we call this precise distance politeness and good manners. People are driven together by the sheer cold of their own internal emptiness. If you rely on the crowd for warmth, you have to accept a certain amount of psychological damage to get it. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer opted out of this transaction entirely. He realized that a person possessing enough internal heat of their own has no need to risk the quills of the crowd. He spent the last 27 years of his life in an apartment along the riverfront in Frankfurt. His days were defined by a strict, solitary routine: studying, playing the flute, reading the London Times, and avoiding the tedious demands of high society. Every afternoon, regardless of the weather, he took a solitary walk with his French poodle. This physical routine mirrored a completely self-directed mental posture. Schopenhauer argued that the desperate need for companionship is a symptom of intellectual poverty. When the mind lacks its own momentum, it is forced to seek external stimulation to stave off the crushing weight of boredom. He viewed the average person as a fraction of a human being. They require a crowd of similar fractions to piece together enough consciousness to feel whole. A truly cultivated mind, however, is a whole number. It functions perfectly in a vacuum. Containing an entire world of thought within yourself, trading your autonomy for the lukewarm comfort of small talk, becomes a terrible bargain. Group dynamics require a process of leveling down. For a crowd to remain cohesive, interactions must default to the lowest common denominator. In these settings, extreme intelligence is essentially contraband. The group expects endless patience for dullness, while viewing any display of real intellect as an offensive threat. To participate, you have to actively shrink yourself. You carve away the complex, idiosyncratic parts of your personality that don't match the people around you. Schopenhauer calculated we forfeit 3/4 of ourselves just to become similar enough to avoid friction. This creates a strange paradox where the people with the most internal value are expected to constantly apologize for it, hiding their capabilities just to maintain the peace. If you have a rich internal life, the company of others rarely compensates for the sheer boredom, the constant annoyance, and self-denial they demand. Ultimately, it is a severely unbalanced ledger. The primary reason we endure this losing transaction is our biological vulnerability to the opinions of others. We actively strive to build a useful reputation, placing our sense of value entirely at the mercy of the crowd. It takes shockingly little to soothe or flatter the human mind. Even when we know praise is entirely unearned, the ego absorbs it instantly, making us slaves to the absolute cheapest currency available. This clinical, unromantic diagnosis of human motivation heavily influenced the next century of psychology. Sigmund Freud directly cited Schopenhauer's porcupine metaphor when mapping the ego and the limits of human intimacy. Basing your happiness on public opinion means your peace of mind is always hostage to a largely irrational mob. Schopenhauer's ultimate conclusion is blunt. True tranquility of the soul is found only in physical and mental solitude. But you don't necessarily have to lock yourself in a 19th century apartment. You can apply this philosophy as a tactical shield in your daily life. When you are forced into disagreeable society, carry some of your solitude with you. You can move through a crowded room or a packed commute while maintaining a completely objective, detached relationship with the environment. Do not expect deep moral or intellectual value from the crowd, and do not immediately say what you think. By dropping your expectations, you create a buffer zone that protects your attention. Treat society like a fire. A wise person warms themselves at a proper distance. They do not walk directly into the flames, nor do they run away shivering. They hold a firm, impenetrable boundary. You dictate your own internal weather. The chaos outside has no authority over the temperature inside your mind. Many people fear the silence of being alone, treating it as a punishment. In reality, that initial discomfort is just a withdrawal symptom from constant, low-quality stimulation. If you can sit through the temporary boredom, the mind eventually calibrates. The external noise fades, giving way to a profound, self-sustaining clarity. Arthur Schopenhauer lived this philosophy until his final days, maintaining his strict boundaries to the very end. His grave in Frankfurt is marked by a simple, flat stone covered in ivy, bearing nothing but his name. Freedom is not found by seeking the approval and warmth of others. It is achieved by building a fire so bright within yourself that you never need to ask anyone else for heat.